information about the engagement pieces. For today, we're going to start pretty basic and very big picture. That might mean that we go a little bit under the 2 hours that are scheduled, which is fine. And then I will use as much information as I can from comments and questions and answers to kind of guide what we cover and discuss next week. I'm going to move forward here. So I want to start with, before we kind of dive into some of the more specific content and the terms and approach that we're going to take for today, I want to start with a quote by an activist, an anti-racist activist from the South, who is somebody that has really inspired me in my own anti-racism work. One of the things that she said is that in every age, no matter how cruel the oppression carried on by those in power, there have been those who struggled for a different world. I believe this is the genius of humankind, the thing that makes us half divine, the fact that some human beings can envision a world that has never existed. She was put on trial for helping a Black couple in Kentucky by a house in an all-white neighborhood in 1954. And subsequently, and as a result of that, was really involved and invested in civil rights work in the South. And she takes a really interesting approach to her position as a white person at that time, doing racial justice work in the South. So I encourage you to look her up. We may use more of her content as we move forward, but it was a quote that has been really inspiring for me in thinking about hope and how we engage with hope in a process where we see that there's a lot that we can be critical of and feel sad about and angry about. So I want to talk a little bit about, we're going to come back to the agenda each time so you can kind of see where we are in the process. So we started with an introduction, just some housekeeping things about Zoom. We're moving into a connection to purpose. So what is the reason for being here? Some shared language so that we have a clear sense of generally what we're talking about when we engage in these conversations. A discussion on allyship more specifically, and then some homework for next time and next steps, and then a closing. So we will kind of walk through each of these, and as we shift into each of the sections, the agenda will pop up again, just so you have a sense of where we are in this process. So I wanted to start by really trying to center ourselves a bit. I want to encourage you to think about what brought you here today, and breathing and noticing your body to the best of your ability. For some of us, that might be uncomfortable, so it's okay if that's something you choose to not do. You know, we might have different things going on with our body that keeps us somewhat disconnected from that, and that's okay. So let's just center ourselves a bit by taking deep breaths. Can just take a deep one in as best we can and breathe out, and just kind of be present with the moment that we're in right now, and notice if anything's coming up for you, if you're feeling tense or anxious or nervous about being even just participating in this conversation, even in a webinar context, right? Knowing that that can still cause some anxiety in difficult conversation. I also just want to think about how purpose is something that can resonate for some folks and not others. And by this, I mean, when I talk about purpose, I mean, what is the reason for which something is done or created, or for which something exists? So we can ask ourselves a couple of questions here. What is the reason for this work around whiteness, showing up for racial justice and allyship? Why does this work exist? Why does it exist for you? Why does it exist for us? And why does it exist at all for everyone? And I think in the midst of that, we really also want to think about, what is this work? What do we mean when we say this work? So I would love for you to just take a minute. And I know that we're kind of in a quiet environment, and we're not really able to speak to each other out loud on Zoom, but I would love for you to spend some time. I'll give you a couple of minutes just thinking about, why are you here? What brought you here today? We have about 170 people on, and so something made you interested and excited to come today, or curious, and I would love for you to think about why you are here, what brings you to this work, and what is this work to you? What does this mean to you? So if you have access to a piece of paper, if you just want to think about it, if you would like to type something up on a computer, just jotting down some ideas for you, or if you're with someone, if you're with a family member or children or a partner or something, it would be great if you could just think about this for a couple of minutes. And I'm going to pause for a second and allow some space for folks to think about this. So kind of reflect on these questions for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come right back. Actually, Carrie, who's helping us on the chat, just made a suggestion that's a great one, which is if you want to share some of why you're here, you can share it to all the panelists in the chat, and we could call out some of what we're hearing. So if you feel comfortable and would like to share, please feel free to put in the chat what brought you here today and why did you get inspired or excited to join us, and then we'll call out some of the responses. I see I'm here to learn what I don't know. I have some friends who are Black, and I would like to have a better understanding of what they go through and be a better ally for them. I also want to be a part of the solution to the racism instead of neutral or a part of the problem. Deep distress over recent events, quote unquote, I can't breathe. I'd like to work towards recognizing and dismantling my own unconscious bias. I would also like to better articulate what it means to be anti-racist to help others work towards this as well. I want to be able to help to make change, and I don't know where to start. I've come to realize that simply not being racist is not good enough. I need to be actively anti-racist, and I am here to learn more about how to do that respectfully. I would like to better examine how racism shows up in my everyday actions, to learn how to stop upholding a white supremacy culture in our community, frustrating and horror about current events, shock that I'm surrounded by intolerant people, humility that I don't know how to help personally and professionally, relief to find this opportunity. I graduated with an MSW in spring 2019, but a lot of information has changed or shifted since then, and I want to stay up to date with terminology and theories. I would like to help make Fort Collins a safer, more welcoming place for people of color to live, create a better future for our youth, put the effort into making an anti-racist change across our community now. I'm here to learn and connect my work to our community. I'm here to learn new tools I can use to fight against racial oppression. I want to better recognize my own racism, the racist systems we live in, so I can unlearn them and help dismantle those systems. I came here to learn about how to be white, and having white privilege causes me to make assumptions about POC. I desire to learn how to be an ally. I'm here for professional reasons first. I've been pushed to learn more because members of my church want to know more. To become a better ally because I could not stop crying with grief after the George Floyd murders. I'm concerned about how much space I'm taking up as a white woman in these conversations. I'm here because I've been interested in racial justice since I was a child, but my concerns were always disregarded. I see a lot of supporting friends, doing own personal work, be a better mother and daughter. In education, would like to understand how to help students of color. All these are so great. Thank you all so much. And I'm going to save some of this information so we can save the chat I can save it for my own information so that I can kind of use this as help to guide the subsequent conversations. Most of what you have said are things that are on my mind and definitely in the forefront of what I know most folks are asking. I've recently led many conversations, caucusing and otherwise, which I'll talk a little bit about as well, where I'm hearing from a lot of folks about what they want to do and how, and a lot of it feels overwhelming and difficult to step into. So many things that I'm very used to having conversations about. So I'm excited to engage more with you all about this. Some folks are talking about being organizers and love to continue educating communities, educate self personally and professionally, understand how to better show up for BIPOC in Fort Collins and Colorado specifically. So I will say at the moment, y'all, as everybody knows, we're all working from home. I have a foster dog. We foster dogs. And I have one that has to be isolated from the rest of my animals because he's still learning to socialize. And he's in the room with me and is getting a little bit anxious about what's going on outside of my office door. So I just wanted to let you know, in case you hear a dog bark, that might be what's happening. All the things that we have to navigate in being in our home spaces right now. So I really appreciate everything that everyone is sharing, and feel free to continue to reflect on that. I do this work for so many reasons, and my purpose really is that I can't imagine not doing this work. I've done it for about, sort of in a professional realm, about 18 to 20 years. I just, everywhere I go, every job I have, everything that I do is really rooted in an understanding of systemic oppression, and very much in particular anti-racism. It is not something that I can ever imagine choosing not to do, even though I know my privilege would allow me to do so. Every space that I'm in and conversation that I have, I really center this perspective. I should also mention, for folks who may be familiar with Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is a national organization, SURGE, that has local chapters. There was one in Fort Collins for a bit, in Boulder, Denver, and Colorado Springs. I helped found I co-founded the chapter in Denver, and work with the national SURGE team on chapter coaching, and then also am currently in the process of applying to be on their leadership team. So I've been in sort of white anti-racist organizing spaces for a while. I joined SURGE in 2000, I think it was 13, and had been working with them both nationally and locally for a long time. So again, really appreciate all that you're sharing, and want to kind of continue down the path of talking a little bit more about what is this work. So I see some of the whys, and I want to kind of clarify and articulate a little bit the what. So we're going to talk a little bit about some shared language. As many of you probably know, in this work, there's so much jargon, there's so much language, and often we use words without really clarifying what we mean by them. And because of that, it can be really difficult for folks to have a clear sense of where we're coming from when we're engaging in these conversations. So I wanted to put out there some definitions, just so that you have a sense of both context for what we're talking about, but also the ability to engage with those definitions. As we know, many of these words mean very different things depending on context and where we are and what we're talking about. And so want to really put them out there, not as a sort of standalone, end goal of a definition, but more of just engaging in a conversation with you about this. So I picked a few words. There's so many. And I teach a class currently called Power, Privilege, and Oppression at the University of Denver. And we go through many, many more definitions, because often our students come with just curiosity about what a lot of these words mean. And that's true across many different identity groups and conversations of anti-oppression. So we're going to start with social justice. And one of the things that I have a great colleague who I love dearly, she and I work very closely together. She's an expert in learning, so she's an instructional designer. And she often says to us, you talk so much about social justice and social work, but you don't tell us what that actually means. Like, I don't ever see you talking about what social justice means. So I credit her for reminding me that we need to be more clear about what we're talking about. So when we look at definitions of social justice, what we see is it's often defined as the equal access to wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. And it is really interesting when we think about it in that context, because social justice as a concept really arose in the early 19th century during the Industrial Revolution and subsequent civil revolutions throughout Europe, which aimed to create more egalitarian societies and remedy capitalistic exploitation of human labor. So because of the stark stratification between wealthy and the poor during this time, the early social justice language focus primarily on capital, property, and the distribution of wealth. So it's interesting to think about how those have expanded over time as societies have changed, and we've just seen sort of a shift in focus. Not that class and distribution of wealth is not important, but when we say social justice, I'm not sure the fundamental understanding is necessarily always about wealth and equity. It's bigger than that. The other thing to know about this definition is it talks about opportunity, which doesn't mean the same thing as access, experience, and outcome. So one of the things that is really important as we think about social justice and talking about anti-racism, and specifically, is to think not just about the opportunity, but the experience within that opportunity, the outcome of that opportunity, and the access to those things. And so it's a multi-layered conversation that's important. And then by the mid-20th century, social justice had sort of expanded from being primarily concerned with economics to include other spheres. So as I mentioned, race and gender and age, and currently we talk more about size and citizenship and language access as well. And so we don't really have a clear sense of how we measure social justice. Sometimes it's related to policy, but that's certainly not the only way to look at measurements of when social justice has occurred. That's one area in anti-racist and anti-oppressive organizing and practice that's tough, is the evaluation of when it's happening. When it's not policy related, we're looking more at behavior and affect, which can be trickier to evaluate. So that's one thing to be aware of, is just how do we assess when we've accomplished that? And that's a little bit unclear, although there are certainly attempts to do that in equity assessments and other kinds of things like that. The one thing that I did want to mention as we talk about racial justice is that we're not here to debate the existence of racism. That's not what this series is about. Racism is a thing, and it's a thing that white people have a role and responsibility in fighting at multiple levels, in ourselves, in society, etc. So there are differing opinions on the role of white people in this work, which we will talk about. But for now, I want to make it clear that we're not here to debate the existence of racism. The premise of this series is that racism exists, and that you see that you have a role in working against it, and that's why you're here. If you're not here for that, it's your right to choose to not participate. However, we will be focusing mostly on the how and not the if. So we won't be focusing on like, well, should we do this or should we not? The premise of this is, yes, we should be doing this, and this is a conversation about kind of the nuances and complexity of how we actually do that. So when we think about racial justice, it can be defined as working to preserve and expand constitutionally guaranteed rights to people who have historically been denied their rights on the basis of race. Often when we talk about this, it's in the context of law and policy. And the reason for that is that those are places where actionable steps feel more tangible. It's things that we can see, we can point to civil rights legislation, we can point to the Voting Rights Act and subsequent decisions based on that. When we talk about cultural shifts and ideological shifts, they're a little bit harder to pinpoint or feel like we have some control over how we influence them. So when we think about racial justice, and I'll talk a little bit later very briefly about critical race theory, which is a perspective that's rooted in how we analyze laws and policy from a perspective of race, and understanding how laws and policies either inhibit progress around race and racism or promote that. And then, with all the complexity of what laws and policies mean, which is that just because we have a law doesn't mean people follow it. Just because people follow it doesn't mean they're following it in all of its intention. So there's all kinds of complexities when we get into the nuances of a lot of this. And that's something that I encourage you to continue to think about and do in your own spaces, because in spaces like this where it's a webinar and I'm just talking at you, or even if you're in a training, it can be really difficult to get into the level of nuance that comes with day-to-day practice of these things. And so I think as you continue to talk about this, I encourage you to take questions you have, curiosities you have, and bring them into other spaces in your life, whether it's the workplace, other places in the library, or even subsequent sessions with us. So we're going to keep moving forward, and I will continue to just kind of as we're talking, check the question and answer box so that I can answer them along the way. So yes, we do have a question that says, this includes the terrible treatment of immigrants and people trying to get asylum here. Absolutely. Yes. So there's so many things going on right now that reflect our difficulty and challenges with engaging in racial justice. And those include the detention centers and separating families, and currently also looking at the decision to potentially release children from detention centers that was just passed down, I believe, yesterday, but not an additional decision to also release their parents. And so what does that actually mean if that's the route that we're taking as a society, continuing to separate these children from their families in the midst of a COVID crisis, not to mention it just being unethical in the first place. So the other definition that I wanted to clarify, and this is one that's really, I think, tough sometimes for folks to grasp because of the history of what this word means, is white supremacy. So I put in here a quote. So critical race theory and critical race scholars really look at the context of laws and policies, and how policy and law have been instrumental in deciding and defining what whiteness means, and thus the exclusion of folks who do not fit the criteria of whiteness. That has shifted over time. Supreme Courts have made decisions throughout our history that have distinguished white people along the way, sometimes including folks from places like India and Japan, and then subsequently deciding that those folks were not included in whiteness and stripping them of lands. So there's things that have happened historically that have articulated whiteness, and that has shifted. And so as we look at a discussion about what white supremacy means, there are complexities within that I want to clarify. And critical race scholars tend to do a really good job of being able to kind of talk about some of those nuances. So Frances Lee Ainsley, as you can read, says that by white supremacy, I do not mean to allude only to the self-conscious racism of white supremacist hate groups. I refer instead to a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. So that's a really big, it's a big definition and big statement. And the one thing that I want to make sure is clarified is that when we talk currently, we're hearing lots of conversations about white supremacy culture. And I will actually share a document that can be emailed out to you about some articulation of what white supremacy culture actually looks like in the context of organizations. It was written by Okun and Jones. It's a community developed resource where they got together in training spaces with mostly white folks and folks of color and said, what do you consider the culture of whiteness? And so people were able to share what that looks like and articulate very specific aspects of white supremacist culture. When I use that document, and when I was in my PhD program, even my advisors were really hesitant to have me talk about white supremacy, because people think of it as the KKK, people with hoods who are burning crosses. And yes, that's what it means. But it also means, how do we prioritize and lift up a particular way of being in this world by which all others are measured? So any other way of being is measured by this sort of white cultural norms. And then we dictate success and the ways in which people are able to advance either in the workplace or just in society as a whole, based on the criteria of how it measures up to that sort of white cultural norm. So I think that when we talk about white supremacy, we aren't just talking about that interpersonal piece, but we are talking about an overarching cultural perspective that prioritizes a specific way of being over anything else. And some of those characteristics are not ones that are ideal, and some of them are not necessarily bad. They're just things that we tend to say, we like this more than that, and therefore we're going to benefit the folks who exhibit those characteristics over people who do not, or those aren't primary characteristics. So I will talk more about that in the subsequent sessions. It's a little bit of an intense space to start in first for folks who are newer to this conversation. And so we will bring that in subsequent session where we talk and dig a little bit more into those specific aspects of white supremacy. But I wanted to make sure that we were clear on the definition not being just about that interpersonal piece of, you know, members of, you know, alt-right groups, but more of a institutional and ideological narrative that upholds and supports a particular cultural dominance. Okay. So I also want to talk a little bit about this, this framing. So the four eyes of oppression is something that I find really useful in using as a context for how we view the world and the things that are happening in our world. And so they actually are individual elements of how we see not just oppression, but superiority. So the belief that you are better than showing up. And the reason that we do this is that it's important to understand that things are not just happening interpersonally. They're not just happening between one person and another person, or one group of people and another group of people. There are other aspects of oppression that exist and reinforce that individual interpersonal interaction. So I'm going to show a graphic, and I will describe it in case anyone is unable to see this. But so the four eyes of oppression are sort of a lens through which we can view the world. One element of that is ideological. And in this PowerPoint, there's a little box that has like a word cloud under ideological. When we talk about the four eyes of oppression and we talk about ideological oppression, we're talking about cultural narratives that are shared across the country. And we're talking specifically in the US culture, although we could talk about it worldwide, because there's certainly white dominant narratives that exist across the world. But when we think about it in the US, essentially what this means is that I can go to any place in the country. I've traveled all over the country. I've done consulting and training across the country. And everywhere I go, if I ask certain things, people are able to describe that particular group based on these ideological narratives. So for example, if I say, what is an undocumented immigrant? What does that person look like? There's a very specific narrative and ideological framing around what we think that particular name and terminology and group actually looks like and is. That is rooted in oppression. We almost always will hear that folks consider undocumented immigrants to be people from Mexico, primarily Central and South America, most often Spanish-speaking or Latinx, or Indigenous from those communities. We don't think of undocumented immigrants as being from France and Russia and Germany, or even, you know, Africa or Europe or Asia. We don't often consider that, although there are certainly undocumented immigrants in this country from countries all over the world. And that's due to this ideological narrative. Another one that's a great example is welfare queen. It's an older example, right? It's from the 80s in the Reagan era, but the terminology welfare queen, who is the woman, and it's of course a woman, on welfare in this country? Who are the primary people on welfare? And it was an ideological narrative that was intentionally created by the Reagan administration to instill fear in communities, white communities in particular, so that we were afraid of folks abusing, quote unquote, the system. And so when we say welfare queen, it usually implies Black women with multiple children who are do not have a husband or a partner that is male, who are abusing the system and trying to get food stamps, and they just keep having children in order to do so. So that's an ideological narrative that is something that's shared. It's pretty well known. It's a relatively common framing, although completely false. The majority of people on welfare in this country are white, even though there's a disproportionality in terms of number of folks on welfare and the population of folks who represent marginalized populations. So when we talk about disproportionality and disparity, we can kind of get into the nuances of that. So ideological oppression is one element of what we see. The next one is the one we're most often familiar with. This is the one we tend to say, this is like, I am not a racist person. I do not use racist terminology. I don't treat people badly because of their background as a person. I don't yell at people on the street. I don't, maybe you don't call the cops on folks who maybe look like they quote unquote should not be in your neighborhood. Those kinds of things are what we tend to think about. And so we say, because I don't do that, then I can't possibly be complicit in a racist system. And so because of that, we want to set up this structure that where we understand that while you may not do that interpersonal thing, where you say something to your coworker, or you actively, don't welcome folks to the table, that you can still uphold these other pieces of the puzzle that have the same amount, if not more, influence on our institutional and sort of systemic issues that exist in this country. So the interpersonal is that one-to-one, more group-to-group, person-to-person kind of interaction. And then, is the one that tends to be where people are most comfortable talking about like what they see or do or don't do. Institutional is the one that's more focused on laws and policies, systems. So institutional is how our laws, policies, and systems like education system, our media, our healthcare system, our criminal justice system, have practices and policies within them that disproportionately impact folks of color. This can be anything from drug policy to broken windows policing policies, to redlining and housing, to not hiring folks who have felonies on their records, to everything you can think of. Education inequity, all of those things exist under the institutional frame of oppression. Now, I as a white person can every day not be interpersonally interacting with anyone in a racist way, but I still benefit from institutional oppression of people of color as a white person. I can get advantaged because I'm white. I can get hired because I'm white. I can get housing because I'm white in ways that that folks of color don't often experience. Now that doesn't mean that there's not discrimination and prejudice against people, but there's not that institutional element of power and ability to systematically oppress a group of people based on the color of their skin. That part, that power piece, holding positions of Supreme Court justices, holding positions of senators and representatives, governors, being able to legislate and make decisions basically focused on the marginalization of individuals. One example of that is closing of polling locations in the South right now, disenfranchising predominantly Black communities in the South from being able to access their polling locations and be able to vote, currently in the name of COVID, but also historically just in the name of lots of different things, but certainly institutional racism. So those are examples of institutional racism. Someone asked a question about, will we address how the Supreme Court has limited rights? Yes. So we can talk about those things, certainly, and it's definitely a part of institutional oppression. So when we look at decisions that Supreme Court justices have made, one of which was relatively recently in 2013, the decision to shoot down key aspects of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which essentially allowed folks to make changes to election practices in the South that had been previously prohibited by the Voting Rights Act. And so as a result of that 2013 decision, which says that folks in the South who are engaging in elections can do whatever they want, essentially without federal government approval, is now leading them to create these closing of polling locations that are disenfranchising voters, because in certain cities, you'll have one polling location for 600,000 people. And so what does that mean for folks' access and rights to democracy and voting? So that's just one example, but we can certainly talk about more as we move forward. The Supreme Court has obviously very, very high authority and power in making those decisions, and certainly has done it in multiple ways, not just about race, but gender, sexuality, and other things as well. And then the last element of oppression that I want to touch on is called internalized. So this is what we think about ourselves as members of marginalized groups. So what are the messages that happen for me in this ideological space, this interpersonal space, and this institutional space that influence my own internalized sense of my own identity? So do I believe that I am worthy of access to power, of access to rights and responsibilities, healthcare, citizenship, as a result of what I hear in these other three spaces? So internalization of oppression is when we do things that might inhibit our own group's progress or further marginalize our own group because we buy into those narratives that we see in those other three spaces. So this framework is from the Grassroots Institute for Fundraising Training, a national organization that does really amazing work around fundraising specifically for social justice initiatives and by people of color who are often very underrepresented in fundraising. It is a really good framework to use if you are talking with people who are struggling to understand why, if we, have a Black president like Barack Obama, we then don't solve all the issues of racism in this country. It's because just because one thing has happened, we still have all this other context and historical perspective as well as current practices that kind of create this web of the ways in which they intersect to create systems of oppression that we then have to figure out how to identify, how to change. So one of the things I love most about this framework is it actually can help you articulate any one issue within these specific contexts and then identify what can I do in what realm of this in order to create change. So if we were talking about, the Voting Rights Act and the closing of polling locations, how would we look at that from this framing and then identify what is one element of that that I do have some ability to access or have control over? If you're in education, thinking about what are the issues in education that show up around these particular issues, and how can I find one key element within this framing that I can have some sort of influence or impact on? So I do like that it both sets up this perspective of understanding, but also how we actually address those things. So there's a question about not totally understanding internalize. Can you go over that again in one sentence? Yeah, so it's like a very basic example would be, I think I'm really bad at math because I'm a girl, right? So society tells us that girls aren't good at math, that it's not something that women are ever sort of more inclined towards being good at. So then I say, okay, well, I've been told my whole life that girls are bad at math, and so I just believe that I'm bad at math. There's nothing I can do about it. I can't learn. I'm just not capable of doing it. Other examples are folks who are in legislative office, who legislate against LGBTQ rights and are LGBTQ themselves. And so there are aspects of how we internalize all those messages. I am not okay, I am not worthy, I'm not good enough, I don't deserve citizenship. I crossed the border, I did commit a crime, I shouldn't be here. And so therefore I don't deserve to be here. As opposed to, you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect as a human being. You deserve to have access to rights and all of the things that we offer because you're a human and you have a family and you deserve those things. So internalization is sort of how do we take within ourselves those oppressive messages and then behave in ways that also perpetuate some of those concerns and issues. That one is always tricky. It is a little bit tricky to understand, and it is a little bit different than the others because it's internal. It's about you and not external. But sometimes, often what we see is folks who internalize that then are in positions where they're making policy decisions or practice decisions that reflect that internalization. So, deciding that people don't deserve access to certain rights or should be more concerned about how their community is acting and then legislating and positioning themselves as such. Someone asked a question of, does I deserve more than others fit into this? think so. Well, I mean, if you went the superiority route, yes. So you can internalize superiority, where I think I'm better than everyone else and I deserve more than others. That could certainly fit in here if you're looking at it from the framing of superiority. Someone also mentioned, it seems like people often confuse interpersonal and institutional. People don't seem to understand systems. Absolutely. That is very, very true. We are not often taught in K through 12 education, certainly, and often not even through undergrad. It gets a little better in graduate school, depending on where you are and what program you're in, to think systemically. We're taught to be very sort of in the banking realm of education. Someone tells you something, you take it for, face value. It's exactly what it is. And we are not taught to think critically and to think systemically and really understand how laws and policies and government and institutions work to kind of create or inhibit progress for folks. Or equity, right? So that it gets very complicated. I definitely recommend, you can Google the 4 Eyes of Oppression, and the handout that articulates this is there. It's really easy to find, which is why I love it. It does talk in there about reverse racism. And so just being aware that this framework is essentially saying there is no such thing as reverse racism because there is a power element at play. It doesn't say that you can't have discrimination or prejudice based on skin color, no matter who you are, but it's saying that institutionalized oppression is a one-directional thing. So men engage in institutional oppression of women. Women cannot do that because we don't have access to the same level of power and power spaces as men do. And the same is true for white folks. So white folks have access to power spaces at disproportionate levels. So that doesn't mean that people of color don't have access to power spaces. Absolutely they do. But the extent to which and the number of which is what the question is around power dynamics. So it's just something to think about as you're reviewing that handout if you decide to look at it. Would internalized also capture a white person's own internalized racism, or is that a different context? It's a little bit of a different context. So if we're talking about the 4 eyes in a context of superiority, then internalized superiority is a little bit of that internalized racism. Internalized racism as the term is usually used for folks of color. So how do folks of color buy into messages about their own community as it relates to society's messaging around that? One example of that that's been critiqued pretty often is when Barack Obama or other prominent Black males get up and talk about how it's Black men's responsibility to be a part of family and not sort of give up on their family and be a part of community. That discussion that tends to come up sometimes in spaces when we're talking about Black families can be viewed and critiqued as internalized racism. This assumption that Black men aren't dedicated to their families, Black men are disproportionately impacted by criminal justice. And so when folks are looking at that, they're saying that when we talk about whether or not Black men are actually dedicated to their families, it's an internalized racism piece that isn't acknowledging the disproportionate impact of criminal justice and policing on Black men that has nothing to do with dedication to family, but has something to do with the system and how the system is creating oppression and racism. So that's kind of how that internalized piece has come up in popular conversation over the last 15 to 20 years. And then you can flip these to be ideological superiority, interpersonal superiority, institutional superiority, and internalized superiority. So the narratives that whiteness is better. So ideological superiority around beauty is very much around whiteness is the standard, the beautiful standard. You're aiming towards long blonde hair that blows in the wind with blue eyes, and you're 5'11" or 6 foot, and you're 130 pounds or 125 pounds. That is sort of like the standard of beauty that institutionalizes that ideological superiority of whiteness and white beauty. So all of these things kind of get into some of the nuances of how we can engage in conversations about the different ways in which oppression shows up. So I want to be thoughtful of time and breaks, being in front of, even if you're not the presenter, being on Zoom and sort of trying to intently focus for a long period of time, as many of you have probably seen, is Zoom fatigue. So I want to give us just a short break for anyone who wants to not miss the conversation or have a chance to get up and get some water or go to use the restroom. So I'm going to do about a 5-minute break here. My clock says it's 3 o'clock. So we're about an hour in, and I would love to come back at 3:05. So what I'm going to do is just pause my camera, and then we'll come back right at 3:05. Okay, so it is about 5 minutes after, so folks want to step back into whatever space you were in order to view. Keep going. So I appreciate all of the questions in the chat and the folks who are responding there. I thank you for that. So we're going to come back to the purpose and just think again about why you're here. Has it changed since I last asked the question? I know that oftentimes we come to these things really not having a clear sense of what's going to happen in them or what people are going to say or what the presentation is going to be like. And so just thinking about, did the purpose shift at all in some of these conversations? And if so, why? And if not, why not? Just kind of thinking through some of those things. We have another question about internalized racism. Would internalized racism include anything any of us have internalized about views that things ideological, institutional, et cetera, are good versus bad? It depends on the context. So the internalized piece is a lot about primarily focused on what is it that society says about you as a member of a particular marginalized group, and do you believe that message? So for queer folks, for LGBTQ folks, a lot of times it's like, I don't deserve to be loved because something's wrong with me. For trans people, it's often, I'm less than. I don't deserve to be happy. I don't deserve to be loved. I'm weird. Something's wrong with me, as opposed to I'm just a person who has a different life experience than other people. So it's very much focused on the messages that we receive about our own group and how we believe those or don't. And that can manifest in a lot of ways. Often it's coping mechanisms like drinking or drug use. A lot of times for women in particular, it can show up as eating disorders. I'm not good enough. I can't control this. I don't look the way that I want to. People don't take me seriously. So the thing I can control is my body. It can be, things like, again, like I mentioned, legislating against your own community. So making it so that folks don't have access to rights, even though you are a member of that group, right? So it's a lot of how do we take those ideological narratives and those institutional practices and believe that they're okay, even if they're stripping us of our own rights and our own humanity. And we can talk more about this in subsequent sessions and give more examples when we can come back together. So someone in the chat said, yes, my purpose shifted to finding where I can have an influence. Great, yeah. A lot of that is really overwhelming. And many of my students feel similarly, like, what do I do? Like, I feel very hopeless. I feel like it's too much. It's too big. There's so many things that that I don't know about how to address these problems. And so often that means we don't address them or we don't do anything. And so hopefully this series will lead us towards a better sense of where and how we can impact these issues, as opposed to feeling like you have to tackle all of it, because you certainly don't. It's just not feasible or possible to do that. But what is your sphere of influence? And within that, what can you do? And that's really where we start to see people shifting towards, oh, it's overwhelming, to, oh, it's possible. I can actually have an influence on this. And someone in the chat said, as a trans person with a disability, those descriptions on internalized feelings are so accurate. So that feeling of just not being worthy. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. Okay, just reading the chat and making sure I'm not missing anything. I would say too, like, there's a comment about potentially distinguishing between internalized superiority and internalized racism. So that's confusing, and I can see why that would be. So internalized racism is I am not a person of color, but if I were a person of color, I as a person of color believe the racism that's about me. So it's an internalized racism. If you're white and you internalize the racism of other people, that's considered internalized superiority or internalized dominance. So I am better than, I deserve more than, white people are better, white people are smarter. And sometimes those internalized belief systems are not, we're not aware of them, right? They're not explicit. Sometimes they're implicit things that we don't even know exist, like white neighborhoods are better. That is one where it's an internalized superiority. White neighborhoods are considered better because of the absence of folks of color in them. Many, many times we use language like that and don't realize that's what we're saying, because we're not saying the opposite of that. We're not saying the absence of Black people in my neighborhood makes this a good neighborhood. We're saying the presence of white people makes it a good neighborhood. And in that, we invisibilize that internalized superiority piece. That was an example that was brought up in a discussion on a podcast that I thought was really helpful in articulating some of that in terms of how we think about what districts we move into, what schools our kids go to, and those kinds of things. Okay, so we're going to come back to allyship, but I do want to touch on it. I know it's a place where a lot of people, thank you for asking about that podcast. I don't remember the name of it. It's on, I think it's the podcast on Being, on BEING, and it's the episode that I will find and share it with you all. It was fairly recent, so I will share it with you. So allyship is something that I know, there are a couple things I want to say about it. One is that there are a lot of questions about it, and I think a lot of folks really want to know. Yes, with Resma and Robin DiAngelo. Thank you so much, Carrie. She mentioned it in the chat, and we'll share it with you. Allyship is complicated, and it's complicated for lots of reasons, and there's lots of nuances to allyship. And so I'm going to introduce it here, although we won't get to everything about allyship now, because there's other things we should talk about before we get into and dig into allyship. One of those is white fragility, which we will talk about at a subsequent time, but not today because we don't have enough time to dig into it. But allyship is really something that isn't static, and it's nothing where we have achieved. And so we have to talk a little bit about what that means in the context of this work. There's a comment in the chat that I just want to acknowledge. Notice homophobia wasn't listed in the introduction. Just want to acknowledge for the queer community in addition to the trans community. Absolutely, homophobia is absolutely one that we need to be talking about and is an element of how we engage in intersectional conversations, which we'll also talk about later. So many complexities to this work that covering all of those things can be challenging. Okay. So allyship is a complicated concept, although it seems simple on the surface. According to just the Webster Dictionary, the definition of an ally can be a sovereign state or state associated with another by treaty or league. So a lot of times when we engage in allyship conversations with folks who have not had these discussions a lot, they think about war and military in terms of ally. And so there has been another addition to that definition, which is one that is associated with another as a helper, a person or group that provides assistance and support in an ongoing effort, activity, or struggle, a political ally, now often used specifically of a person who's not a member of a marginalized or mistreated group, but who expresses or gives support to that group. So I just want you to think, as you think about this formal definition, think about what it means to you. Do you agree with the definition? Why or why not? What would you change to make it more true for you? What does an ally mean to you, and how does that align with or differ from this more like formalized definition of allyship? And you can feel free to put that in the chat if you have a reflection on that. I will say that one of my reactions to this definition is the helper element of this. So as a social worker, we're very conditioned to think about our role as helpers, but helpers comes with some level of both like paternalism and patronizing, and also assuming that we have the answer and that we are there to help or impart something on someone else. And when we look at critiques of allyship and conversations about it, it's really less about helping and more about seeing your struggle as aligned with the struggle of someone else, And in addition to that, to use sort of more liberatory language, that your liberation really relies on the liberation of everyone, that none of us are free until all of us are free. So it's not about helping, it's about standing in solidarity with and in alignment with a particular struggle, even when you're not necessarily the one who's impacted by that. And yeah, so someone in the chat says associate it with heroism, which is not the goal. And someone in the chat asked about the term accomplice. Yes, so for folks who haven't heard this, many people are shifting to the use of accomplice versus ally. And accomplice really means a bit more around like, what are you risking? That when you're an accomplice in something, there's actually a risk to what you're doing, as opposed to allyship, which feels a little bit more passive. Some folks can, I think talking about allyship from a framing of accomplice can be challenging for folks who are new to this conversation. Because when you read about being an accomplice, it's asking you, what are you risking? Are you risking your job? Are you giving up your land? Are you risking your safety, bodily safety? And for some people, that feels overwhelming. So generally, when I start the conversation, I use allyship as a way to enter into a discussion about allyship and then move into more of a complex discussion about when we are comfortable enough for, with the concept and the idea and are willing, how do we step into a space of risk? Am I willing to step up in a meeting if I know that my boss might get mad enough to sanction me? Those are risks that are hard to ask folks to take. And so how do we ease them into an understanding of what that might look like and how to do those things, with assessing your own sense of ability to engage in more of a complex allyship behavior, which I think accomplice speaks to. Some folks are talking in the chat about being uncomfortable with the idea of calling myself an ally, because it's historically been used by folks in a very passive way. As in, they'll say they support Black people without actually doing anything. And so I tend to prefer accomplice because it really focuses on that action piece. Absolutely. I always tell this story. A very dear friend of mine who has been a family friend since I was born. So it's a really close friend of my parents. She came up to me as a lesbian when she was 16, or when I was 16, I apologize. And subsequently, like, we sort of, had discussions about that and relationship around that. And one year, probably about 10 or 15 years ago at Christmas, she gave me a t-shirt that said ally, and it was in rainbow colors. I actually identify as queer. It's a very complicated conversation to have with her because my partner is male identified. So anyway, that's beside the point, but she gave me the shirt that said ally, and I was like, I'm never gonna wear this. Like, why would I wear this out in public and just like declare myself an ally? And that's, I think, a little bit of maybe some of what you're talking about, Theo, which is like, people tend to just like proclaim allyship, and you can wear a t-shirt and be an ally, as opposed to actually having to work at it every day. And so I don't call myself an ally. I allow folks around me to determine whether or not I'm earning that on a daily basis. And that looks so different for everyone. I have some friends who really consider me an ally if I behave one way, and another group of friends with the same identity who might have a totally different perspective on what allyship means to them. And so allyship, for that reason, can be very complicated. And that's why I said that we'll start the conversation, but we're not going to get into all the nuances today, but we certainly will come back to all of the complexities of that. And one example, a more specific example of that, is that I have a really good friend who's from Japan, who loves to talk about being from Japan, and she loves when people ask her where she's from. It's her favorite thing to do, to talk, just tell people all about her culture and where she comes from and what it was like to come to the United States and those things. And I have another friend who is Mexican, but is from Colorado and has been here for generations of her family. And when she's asked where she's from, she does not like that question. It feels like she doesn't belong here. The implication is You don't belong here, so I'm going to ask you where you're from. So for one friend, if someone walks into the room and I'm with her and they say, where are you from? If I intervene and try to address that, she's going to see that as not allyship behavior because she likes the question and is fine answering it. Whereas my other friend would potentially want, I would have to make sure, right, me to intervene and correct that question for her because it makes her feel like someone's asking her to describe how she belongs, where she belongs, and justify her existence. So a lot of that is where we step into some of that complexity. And someone else in the chat mentions white saviorism. That's another aspect of allyship we have to really think about is what are we doing and what's the purpose of what we're doing? And is it actually with the permission of the folks that we're potentially doing it on behalf of? And that can look very complex, which is why I think people sometimes are afraid to step into allyship space because they don't know if their behavior is going to be accepted or welcomed. And there's so many complexities around that that we'll continue to talk about. Just checking the chat to make sure there's nothing I need to address out loud. Someone says, ally, it makes me feel like allies who are non-marginalized are teaching us marginalized how to be better. What makes the allies know better or more? It feels as allies are superior. Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to be really thoughtful of that. And there has not been enough discussion, in my opinion, around allyship with that level of nuance, which is, what is it that we're doing and why? And how are we in relationship to the group or the person that we are supposedly supporting or acting in solidarity with? Stepping into a space without knowing for sure if that behavior is welcomed is not allyship, right? So a lot of the nuances of allyship come with understanding the relationship. How do you know this person? How do you know if they want you to step into that space? If you're in a meeting and you notice that only white folks are talking, do your colleagues of color want you to point that out, or will that draw more attention and force them to be put on the spot to have to answer something that they weren't prepared to nor really wanted to answer in that moment? So you have to be really thoughtful about how you're able to kind of step into some of those spaces. Yes, it can absolutely be virtue signaling, which means that you're sort of like notifying people like, hey, I'm an ally, look at the behavior I just did. I want you to see that I'm not racist. And so sometimes allyship is performative, meaning we're behaving in a way that demonstrates to everyone this specific message we want to send. I'm not a racist person, so see all the things that I'm doing to prove to you that I'm not racist. And so allyship requires a lot of just self-awareness and self-reflection and subtlety and understanding and being able to kind of navigate those spaces and what that actually means and looks like. And that's true across the board. That's not specific just to racism. It's specific to all identities. We have to be really thoughtful about the ways in which we step into spaces or not as allies or accomplices, and whether or not we know that those behaviors and spaces are appropriate for us to be doing those things in. Someone asked about advocate use sometimes. How does that compare with ally? It's a great question. I have not heard that word very commonly in my social justice spaces. I hear it a lot in social work spaces. So for me, if you were asking just my personal perspective on that, I see advocate as someone who is acting on behalf of. From a social work perspective, that's very much how it's used. So I steer clear of advocate unless I'm talking about a system where I'm like, oh, I'm a advocate for someone like in the court system and I'm the liaison between the court system and this person. So I can like help advocate for them when they can't for themselves. So in formalized spaces where people literally don't have a voice, like they cannot speak, advocating is something that I think is how I understand that term, whereas allyship and solidarity and accomplice behavior is a little bit less of that on behalf of and more in line with or in solidarity with alongside. Okay. So this might touch on some things I've already mentioned, but when we talk about allyship, we're generally speaking about people's willingness to step into a conversation or a situation from a place of relative privilege to address something that's happening to someone else, or a policy that will impact a group of people. That could perpetuate harm simply based on that person's group or group's membership as a part of a marginalized population. We're typically talking about race, gender, sexuality, ability, class, but there are other identities that can be included here as well: citizenship, language, size, education, etc. So there are multiple ways that allyship can show up. And when we're talking about, in general, when we're talking about it, we mean someone who has a privileged identity in relationship to a marginalized identity, standing up for something where there's a risk involved. So sometimes one example of this is that when I'm at work, there are some times when we'll be in a meeting and my colleagues of color will text me and say, can you say this out loud for me, because I don't feel comfortable saying this, or I know it will be received differently if you say it than if I do. And because of my relationship to them, I have a relationship with them, both personal and professional, then I know that they're asking me to do that. And I often will ask, like, do you want me to attribute that to you, or do you not want it to be attributed to you? And then I will follow what they've asked of me. So there have been many times when I've been asked in a meeting to speak on behalf of someone, either identifying them or not, based on what they've requested of me. And so that's an example of where someone has built a relationship with me that allows them to feel like they can trust me enough to speak up in a space to say something maybe they don't feel comfortable saying. I would never do that if I was not asked, right? I would never speak on behalf of anyone unless someone asked me to do so. And then obviously having to try to address the situation of why can't they speak? Why do they not feel comfortable speaking for themselves? What's happening in this space that we need to address that causes it to be difficult for that person to speak up? And in some instances, it's just simply, I don't want to engage in this conversation because I'm tired. And so I want the conversation to happen, but I don't want to be the one managing it. So can you take that on? And in some cases, it's I actually don't feel like I will be heard, or I feel like I might be disproportionately penalized for saying something. The context really matters in that regard. There's so many other examples, and we'll come back to this and talk more about it in another session, but just wanted to kind of introduce it here and have some space for that. So we're at about 3:30, and I'm nearing the end of what I had prepared for today, which is actually pretty good timing. I think an hour and a half is usually people's attention span for Zoom anyway. So I wanted to put up some, oh, I put it on here. Of course I did. I forgot that I put it on here. I've done a couple different presentations this week and couldn't remember what I put in this one. So the podcast that I mentioned earlier is this one. It's a discussion between Resmaa Menakem and Robin DiAngelo about racism and whiteness. It's an On Being podcast. There have been critiques of Robin DiAngelo and white fragility that I definitely think some are very, I agree with and are warranted. I think some of it comes up for me in this podcast, so I'm really curious to hear what folks' reactions are to this. Johanna has the PowerPoint in a PDF, which has these links embedded, so we will get that to you. You registered for this, so we should have all of your emails. And so this podcast actually brings up some of the critiques of Robin DiAngelo and the way that she's speaking about her work. And so if that comes up for you too, I welcome it, because it's definitely something that folks are talking about in terms of her and her approach to white fragility conversations. But it's a really good podcast. And Resmaa is talking about sort of the embodiment of trauma in folks of color's bodies and in relationship to racism. I also would love for folks to read this article. It's called White Beloveds, Black Lives Matter is Not a Trend. It's an invitation to own our freedom too. And then lastly, just think about what you want your action to be. What are your next steps? How can you incorporate more of these conversations or actions or changes into your own lives, at work, with family, in your community? And maybe it's a small step between now and next week when you come back. Hopefully you come back. I'd be excited to see folks again, or hear from you again on chat, I guess. Yes, I can put the link in the chat, or somebody in the chat monitoring space should be able to do that. If anybody has trouble accessing the link, I'll do it after I stop sharing. I really want you to think about the small steps you can take in between our discussions And remember, don't just act out of desperation. This work takes a really long time. I've been doing it for a long time, and it's most of what I do every day, all day long. That doesn't mean I'm arrived or that I don't have room to grow, but I've learned so much along the way that if I had jumped into action early on, I probably would have caused a lot more harm than just kind of being patient and recognizing that I don't have to do 100 things tomorrow. I can do one thing, and then I can learn and do another thing. And so it's urgent. People's lives are at stake. Yes, 100%. But we have to be very intentional and thoughtful about how we do this so we don't cause more harm. And so whatever that means for you, if you're someone who's like, I've done all of this, I want to like step into direct action, like great, do that. I'm so excited for you to do that. But if you're like, this is the first time I'm even remotely trying to have this conversation, maybe start with a friend, start with a family member, start with someone, or even just a post on Facebook. Honestly, like if you'd asked me 20 years ago, I would have been like, there's no way that's enough. But for some folks, that's a lot, and you're risking something when you do that. Sometimes relationships and very close ones. So remember that it's okay to start where you're at, and that I will help you in this series, hopefully, start to gain more confidence in being able to move forward. So we will get this out to you. I did want to just do a quick closing. So Adrienne Marie Brown is a phenomenal, wonderful activist. She is amazing and wrote 2 books with a 3rd one on the way. Her first book is called Emergent Strategy. The second one is called Pleasure Activism. I have had the benefit of seeing her facilitate in person a long time ago. It's probably 2010 maybe. And she's phenomenal. And I love her work because it really pushes me to be in a space of love and community rather than judgment and anger, which is really easy for me to go to because this work is frustrating. But she said something that I think really resonates. Things are not getting worse. They are getting uncovered. And we must hold each other tight and continue to pull back the veil. And I want to do just a little reading about what she says in relationship to this specific quote. She says, "Why can't we sleep? Why are we in extreme patterns of drinking, smoking, and numbing? Why are so many of us in pain as our bodies try to keep up with the news? Why are so many of us in a panic all day, every day? And those that aren't sound like they are in denial or rocking unearned hubris. Perhaps the number one privilege of being an American is our narrative. We have a story that covers all of our wretched behavior that makes us exceptional regardless of what we do. We've gotten lost in that story. We have believed that the beautiful princess wanted us for our virility. The apple was a nutritious offer from a frenemy. Oz was a magical city, and that we are a benevolent, caring nation that really loves all of our differences, our democracy, our global nature. That we were almost there to that place where we can know we are better than this. As a nation, we have quietly turned away from any numbers that seem to make a counter argument about what we were up to. The suicide rates of trans people, the number of bodies along our southern border, the increasing rate of C-sections and sterilization and fibroids among women of color and poor women, the length of the existing wall, the number of people killed by our drones, the percentage of Black people in prisons, the pace at which people of color are murdered by the state, the rising heat and ocean levels during this golden age of global warming, and so much more. So what feels new is the unveiling. The heaviness is the increasing weight of the truth becoming undeniable as more people believe it. Right now, more and more of the truth of this country at this time is visible, left naked, made obvious. Not only are each of us right about the particular crisis we've been holding, but others coming up out of their silos are right too, and the intersecting crises are massive. We have to be willing to engage in radical resistance and radical futuring because people are looking at us. Well, you were right. Now what do we do? We must increase our collective tolerance for truth. This means we must learn how to hold the full breadth of emotions we feel upon hearing the truth and to keep listening, changing, taking action, learning. We must be willing to look at what actually needs to happen to address the truth. We must deepen our connections to each other. There's no way the majority of us will survive this time if we continue working in isolation or in competition. We must divest. I'm still trying to figure out what this looks like in real time. I also think we need to learn to divest our attention from the circus in DC. I'm grateful for those who have focused on tracking our resistance. Not only are we the ones we have been waiting for, but this is the exact moment we have been shaped for. And even though it came so quickly, it has actually taken forever. The veil never hid us from others. It only ever hid us from ourselves. Now that more of us can see who we truly are, we must begin and continue to move towards who we really want and need to be in order to sustain human life on this planet. Liberation is no small task. It is appropriately daunting for miraculous beings. It is a gift to be given such undeniable purpose, such immense odds. Hold each other tight and let's do this work. So I thank you all so much for your time and attention and energy on an afternoon for a decently long time. I really look forward to hopefully having you with us next week, where we will continue the conversation. So thank you all so much for your time, and have a great day.